Welcome to The Nudge, where small shifts create powerful transformation. I'm Andrea McCabe, heart centered educator and architect of awakening. In the last episode, I spoke about something I call the nudge, the quiet moments in life where something inside of us says, this way, a subtle pull, a gentle redirection, a feeling that something in our lives is asking us to move differently. These nudges can change our life. And they also raise an important question. Where do they come from? Are they instinct? Intuition? Is there something happening in our nervous system? Or is it something spiritual? I have my own thoughts about that. In fact, I believe in angels. And let me tell you why. There were things I experienced in high school that I hid from everyone. At the time, I didn't fully understand how wrong it was. I just knew that something about it didn't feel quite right. I began isolating from my friends. I became very secretive. And most important of all, I started to lose myself. I rationalized what had happened to me. I convinced myself that it was probably all my fault. So I pretended everything was fine, even though inside I was confused and felt terribly alone. By the time I reached second year university, the trauma had caught up with me. The shame, the guilt, the avoidance, the isolation, and the internal pain that I couldn't share with anyone began to affect my day-to-day life. From the outside, everything looked normal, but inside, that was a different story. The truth was, I wasn't really going to class. In fact, I'd wake up late. I'd catch the bus downtown, I'd wander around for a bit, and then I'd meet my friends for lunch at the university. Then I'd head back to my old high school, the place where the trauma began, to coach basketball. Because coaching was one of the few places that I felt like myself. I could build a team. I could help students grow. It gave me a sense of purpose. But the rest of my life, it felt like it was slowly unraveling. At that point, I was numbing the pain a lot with alcohol. I couldn't bear that shame, that guilt, all of that was connected to what I experienced. So eventually, I reached a point where I began thinking about how I was going to escape in a very practical way. One day, I made a plan. It wasn't necessarily to end my life, and I certainly didn't plan to do it that day. But I had to figure out what I was going to do if things got worse. So the area I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, was very close to the Niagara Escarpment. And this escarpment in Hamilton is called the Mountain. So I drove my parents' car up the mountain. I was looking for a place that I could drive off, fully assessing, fully evaluating all the possibilities. I drove along the road. I was like, I couldn't go off there. It's too dense there. Oh, I'd probably just hit some trees and like I'd break my nose or something. So it really became, I can't find a place that it would be perfect. So I realized that it just wasn't what I was going to do. I drove down the mountain, realizing that this is a failed attempt. I realized that if I even tried something like that, my parents' car would be destroyed and then I'd have all of this explaining to do. And I didn't want to talk to anybody about what was going on. So, as I was driving down, I started to feel really defeated. I started to feel numb. There was an emptiness inside. Before I continue this story, though, I really do want to state this. In this episode, I'm talking about a very personal experience from a time in my life that felt really dark. If any part of this story resonates with something you may be going through right now, please know you don't have to carry it alone. There are people who care deeply about your safety and well-being, and there are trained professionals who are ready to listen and help. If you're in Canada, you can reach Talk Suicide Canada at 1 833 456 4566 or text 45645. For my friends listening in the United States, you can call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you're from another country, please consider reaching out to a local crisis line, a mental health professional, or someone you trust. You deserve support, you deserve care, and your life matters. Now back to the story. I was in that place of despair, preparing to go home, and before I was fully down the mountain, something happened that I just can't explain. It was a wave of love that flooded my body. It wasn't subtle. It was actually overwhelming. It was immediate. It was real. To this day, I really don't know what it was. If you would ask me what I perceived in that moment, I would say that it was like looking into the eyes of God. It was that profound for me. Was it an angel? Was it divine intervention? Was there a deeper part of me that refused to give up? I honestly don't know. All I know is that something surged inside of me as a result of this. And I don't even know if I said these words out loud or just in my mind, but this is what I said. I'm going to become a teacher. I'm going to make a difference. And if things ever get this bad again, I'm going to talk to someone. Now, I know those words came from somewhere deep inside me because this was not the way that my family related to things. You didn't talk about anything in my family. So it felt like I was reclaiming or rediscovering or opening up a part of myself that had been stripped away by that trauma and that I now knew was a part of me. In that moment, I realized something profound. Love compelled me to listen. Angels walk among us, my friends, and they come in many different ways. You see, our inner guidance doesn't always arrive that loudly. Sometimes our signal is very subtle, sometimes it's just a quiet piece of information. And sometimes, like I did many times in my life, we ignore it. So let me tell you about a time I was actually forced to listen. It was years later. I was driving on a rural road after a snowstorm. The road didn't seem bad. It felt very clear. I was very confident, behind the wheel, cranking up the tunes. And then I heard something. Slow down. It was a very clear message. I completely ignored it. In fact, I argued with it. I was like, there's no snow on the ground. This is ridiculous. I don't have to slow down. I'm a good driver. And then suddenly, I saw it. I rounded a curve. There's a massive snowdrift blocking the road. My body went immediately into survival mode. My heart started pounding, and every part of me became incredibly focused. And I remember asking internally, what do I do? The response was immediate. Take your hands off the wheel. Now, logically, it made no sense. But in that moment, I stopped arguing. I let go. The van I was driving hit the drift, and immediately I was bouncing everywhere from one side of the road to the other side of the road, fishtailing and spinning, and all of a sudden I ended up in the ditch. My van was completely facing the opposite direction. Everything became still. I was sure that my van was probably wrecked, but there was no movement inside the vehicle, just quiet. And I remember sitting there thinking, I can't believe I didn't get hurt. And at the moment it crossed my mind, whack! My knee slammed hard into the steering column. The next day, my partner and I were supposed to travel to Sedona. Now, we still went, even though I was walking with a cane. Instead of hiking like we normally did, I spent a lot of time sitting around, watching my beautiful partner walk up these red hills and really craving the ability to walk up there with her. It was so disappointing. Sedona is one of those places where you just want to walk and walk and walk through those red rocks and explore. So inside, I was very frustrated. Even after I returned home, I needed that cane for a few weeks. And every step was a reminder. Andrea, listen. Now, I don't believe we're punished for our actions, but I do believe that sometimes life gives us feedback. Something inside me was clearly saying, next time, listen. And truthfully, I was lucky. That lesson could have been much worse. The question becomes, how do you know when it's your inner voice and not just another thought? So this is what I've learned. A thought is noisy. It has commentary. It tries to justify itself. It tries to convince you. It often carries emotions like there's an urgency, there's a fear, there's an excitement, there's an anxiety, almost like there's a spiral to it. Thoughts try to control the situation. But your inner voice, it doesn't spiral. It does not argue. It states, it says something, and then it becomes quiet. See, thoughts are constant mental activity. Your inner voice lands more like a knowing. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And somehow that whisper carries great authority. It makes me think about how animals respond in the wild, and something that as humans we've lost along the way. So if a deer hears a sound in the forest, it doesn't turn to the other deer and say, "Hey, what are you thinking? Is that a predator coming at us?" It's not like, "Oh, let's convene a meeting and let's talk about it." It doesn't debate all the possibilities. It responds. Something in it, activated by the nervous system, already knows that something's changed. As humans, we have that same biological capacity, and many of us were taught to override it. We analyze, we seek permission, we ask everyone around us what they think. And sometimes we talk ourselves out of the very signal that was trying to help us, just like I did on that rural road. Before we talk about listening to the inner voice, I'd like to help you understand something that I think is important. When our nervous system is stressed, the brain shifts into survival mode. Inside the brain, there's a structure called the amygdala. That's like the brain's alarm system. When the amygdala detects danger, whether it's real or perceived, it activates a chain reaction in the body. First, it signals the hypothalamus, and this acts like a command center. The hypothalamus then activates the pituitary gland, which sends out signals to the adrenal glands located above the kidneys. This HPA axis activates the system where there's a release of cortisol, which is one of the body's primary stress hormones. Okay, so why am I telling you all about this science? It's actually because the science matters. See, when we get this flood of cortisol in our body, the brain shifts its priorities. It moves from reflection to reaction. So in simple terms, when we're stressed, we react instead of listening. And if the inner voice arrives quietly, it becomes much harder to hear when the body's in survival mode. So one simple way to calm the nervous system when you're experiencing this kind of activation is something called the physiological sigh. It's actually quite simple. You take in 2 short breaths through your nose and then 1 long breath out your mouth, like this. Try it with me. Sometimes I repeat this several times if I feel activated. What this breathing pattern does is it helps us regulate our nervous system and it lowers the stress response. There actually is a physiological reason for this. When we take the two short inhales, we help reopen the tiny air sacs in our lungs called alveoli. These sacs allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to exchange more efficiently. The long exhale then helps release excess carbon dioxide, and it signals the nervous system to relax. When the body becomes calm, the mind becomes much easier to listen to. And when the mind becomes quiet, that's often when the inner voice becomes easier to hear. So there's something I want you to know. Listening to your inner voice, it's a skill. And like any skill, it becomes clearer when you practice it. Over time, I began noticing a few simple things that helped me access my guidance more consistently. So I'm going to offer you a 6-step way to begin listening to your inner voice. These steps aren't complicated. They're simply ways to create the conditions where that quiet signal becomes easier to hear. We've already talked about the physiological sigh and how the breathing pattern can change the chemistry of the body to help regulate the nervous system. So step 1 is calm the nervous system. Our breath is one of the most powerful ways we can shift our internal state. But there are other ways as well. Some people use toning, where you hum or make gentle sounds that help vibrate through the body. Others use visualization or meditation. Sometimes calming the nervous system is as simple as removing yourself from an environment that feels chaotic. The important thing is to find out what works for you. Because when your nervous system is calmer, the mind becomes quieter. And that's when the inner voice is easier to hear. Step 2, ground the body. Grounding helps bring our awareness fully into the present moment. Some people use tools like grounding pads or grounding sheets that connect to the earth electrically. I actually have a couple of those I use at home. But grounding can be much simpler. You can ground through your breath, through visualization, through meditation. One practice that works really well for me is I imagine the roots of trees growing from the bottoms of my feet and anchoring deep into the earth. I then picture those roots connecting into the earth's energy. It reminds my body that I'm here, that I'm present. Another grounding practice is something called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. This exercise uses your senses to bring awareness into the moment. So you simply name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. This simple exercise can pull your attention out of anxious thinking and help bring you back into your body. And my friends, when we're present in the body, we've become more aware of the subtle symbols around us. Step 3, reconnect with your body's signals. The body is constantly communicating with us. Many of us were never taught to listen to those signals. One simple way to reconnect with the body is through contraction and release. For example, you can clench your fists very tightly, hold that contraction, and then release. Notice the difference between those two sensations. You can do the same thing with any muscle group in your body. Contract, release. When we practice noticing those sensations, we begin rebuilding awareness of our body's signals. And that awareness becomes very important when we start listening to our inner guidance. Step 4, ask a clear question. If we're trying to get information If we're trying to connect with our inner voice and connect with what our next steps are with something that's really important to us, we need to ask clear questions that invite information instead of forcing an answer. One word I 100% avoid when asking questions is the word should. When we ask should questions, there's usually someone else's voice attached to it. Should I do this? Should I do that? Often there's a pressure, an expectation, a fear of judgment that is associated with our shoulding ourselves. So instead, try asking questions that invite guidance. For example, what would be the highest and best for my body to eat tonight? Maybe the answer is tacos from the taco truck. Maybe it's fresh chicken salad. But when we ask the question in an open way, we give ourselves space to actually listen to the response. Step 5, notice how the information arrives. Different people receive inner guidance in different ways. There's a field called neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, that studies how our internal experience works. One observation from NLP is that people often move their eyes in different directions depending on how they're accessing information. For example, if someone is recalling an image, they may naturally look upward because they're visualizing something. If someone is listening for something that they're hearing, they may look to the side. And if someone is sensing or feeling something internally, they may look downward. In intuitive language, we sometimes refer to these ways of perceiving in this way. So our clear seeing is our clairvoyance. So if we're wanting to connect with our clear seeing, we look up. Our clear hearing is clairaudience. And if we want to connect with our clear hearing, we look to the side. Our clear feeling is called clairsentience, where we look down to access that clear feeling. Some people receive inner guidance as an image. Some hear a word or phrase. Others feel something in their body. And some people experience something that's just a strong inner knowing, a claircognizance. You may want to experiment and notice how your information tends to arrive. Step 6, learn to recognize the signal. Remember what we talked about earlier. The thinking mind tends to be complicated. It debates, it argues, it spirals. The inner voice is usually calm and simple. It says something clearly, and then it becomes quiet. Learning to recognize that difference is one of the most important parts of this practice. And like I said before, like any skill, it becomes easier with practice. So the next part is I want to invite you into this idea of discernment. Listening to your inner voice isn't about blindly following every thought that pops into your head, because some of them can be so incredibly random. It's about learning to recognize the signal. The way to do that is practice. I'm going to share a very practical example of how I practice listening to my inner voice that actually started after the incident on that rural road. I remember thinking very clearly, okay, I need to learn how to listen. I didn't want to end up in another situation like that. So I created what I call my daily commute practice. For years, I drove the same road to work. It was almost 20 kilometers each way. For my American friends, that's about 12 miles. Once I got into the city, the traffic would start to build. So it's then I'd asked a very simple question. Which lane is best for me to arrive safely and quickly? Let me know when I should change lanes. I shoulded myself. Oh my gosh. Maybe I better rephrase that question. Which lane is best for me to arrive safely and quickly? Let me know when it's best for me to change lanes. Okay, that lands a lot better for me. No attachment to it. I'm listening to my inner voice, I'm not hearing anyone else's voice. I've got it. Okay. Then I just drive. Music on, relaxed, chilling, but paying attention. Sometimes I'd hear something simple like, move into the right lane. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the car ahead of me in the left lane would be turning left. Traffic would stop. By following that little nudge, I ended up with a clearer path. Check. Awesome. This is working. Until I'd hear something like turn right, and I'd start to argue. I think, seriously, that makes no sense. My normal route is straight ahead. I'm going to end up being late for work. And I ignore it. And sure enough, a few minutes later, there'd be construction or a detour or something that would force me to find another route. Those moments became kind of a training ground for me. Not for making big life decisions, but for learning how my inner voice actually shows up. You might be thinking, okay, Andrea, that's great for you. But here's the truth. I had a very strong motivation to learn from this. I didn't want to be walking with a cane again. So I became very intentional about paying attention. And over time, something interesting happened. I learned how to get out of my way. Because the biggest thing that interferes with inner guidance, it's usually us. Our doubt, our overthinking, our need to analyze everything. So before we close today, I want to come back to something we talked about earlier. The inner voice, the quiet signal, the knowing that sometimes shows up and says something simple like, slow down, or turn here, or this way. It's often easy to dismiss those moments because they don't arrive with fanfare. They arrive quietly. But sometimes those quiet signals can change the direction of our lives. And when we start paying attention, we begin to realize something important. The guidance was probably there all along. We just weren't taught how to listen. Now, earlier, I said something that might surprise some people. I said I believe in angels. That's my personal way of understanding some of these moments. But I also want to be very clear about something. You don't have to believe what I believe. Some people understand this as intuition. Some people see it as the nervous system recognizing patterns. Some call it inner wisdom, and some people experience it as something spiritual. The label is not important. What matters is learning to recognize that something inside us is capable of guiding us. The inner voice doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It doesn't try to convince you. It simply offers information and then waits. The real question is never whether that signal exists. The question is whether we're willing to slow down enough to hear it. Because when we calm the nervous system, we become present in our body. When we allow the noise of thinking to settle, something remarkable starts to happen. We start to recognize the difference between the constant activity of thought and the quiet authority of inner knowing. Pay attention to those quiet moments, the gentle redirections, the small nudges that are easy to dismiss. Because sometimes the smallest signal is pointing towards the biggest shift. And when that moment comes, honor the nudge, because shift happens. Thank you for joining me in this episode of The Nudge. Next week, we're going to explore something that makes listening to your inner voice much easier. We're going to talk about quieting the active mind. Because the truth is, most of us aren't struggling to hear our inner voice. We're struggling to hear it over the noise. I'll see you next week. Until then, be well and honor that nudge.